Contemporary philosophical debates about the concept of race can be divided into three competing types of accounts: racial skepticism, racial constructivism, and racial population naturalism. For the next couple of minutes, I'll guide you through the assumptions and implications of each of these accounts. Also, for the purposes of what follows, we will understand racial naturalism to stand for the old biological conception of race, which is criticized by all the three accounts I just mentioned. Racial naturalism depicts races as bearing biobehavioral essences. That is, underlying natural, perhaps genetic properties that are heritable, shared by all and only members of a race, and explain behavioral, categorological, and cultural dispositions of individual persons and racial groups. Let us start with racial skepticism, which holds that because racial naturalism is false, races of any type do not exist. Racial skeptics such as Anthony Appiah and Naomi Zak argue that the term race cannot refer to anything real in the world, since the only thing in the world to which the term could uniquely refer, that is, discrete, essentialist, biological races, have been proven not to exist. Zak, for instance, provides a summary of the racial skeptic's argument against the biological foundations for race. She summarizes the scientific rejection of essences, geography, phenotypes, post-Mendelian transmission genetics, and genealogies as possible foundations for races. Let's take each in turn. Aristotelian essences, thought to ground the common characteristics of distinct species, were correctly rejected by early modern philosophers. If essences cannot even ground differences among species, then they clearly cannot ground the differences among races, which even 19th century racial science still understood as members of the same species. Then, folk theories rely on geography to divide humanity into African, European, Asian, and Amerindian races. But contemporary population genetics reveal the emptiness of this foundation for two reasons. First, geographically based environmental stimuli lead to continuous physical adaptations in skin, hair, and bone rather than discrete differences associated with race. And second, although mitochondrial DNA mutations provide evidence of the geographical origins of populations, these mutations do not correlate with the physical traits associated standardly with racial groups. Similarly, phenotypes cannot ground folk theories for race. For instance, differences in skin tone are gradual, not discrete, and blood type variations occur independently of the more visible phenotypes associated with race, such as skin color and hair texture. Race cannot be founded upon transmission genetics either, since the genes transmitted from one generation to the next lead to very specific physical traits, not general racial characteristics shared by all members of a putatively racial group. And finally, genealogy cannot ground race, since populations descended from a common ancestor may have common genetic characteristics, but these need not correlate with the visible traits associated with race. So, Naomi Zak concludes, essences, geography, phenotypes, genotypes, and genealogy are the only known candidates for physical scientific basis of race. Each fails, therefore there is no physical scientific basis for the social racial taxonomy. Racial skeptics like Appiah and Zak recommend discarding the concept of race entirely according to the following argument. Because of its historical genealogy, the term race can only refer to one or more discrete groups of people who alone share biologically significant genetic features. Such a monopoly on certain genetic features could only emerge within a group that practices such a high level of inbreeding that it is effectively genetically isolated. Such genetic isolation might refer to the Amish in America or to the Irish Protestants, but it clearly cannot refer to those groupings of people presently subsumed under American racial census categories. So because the concept of race can only apply to groups not typically deemed races, see Amish, Irish Protestants, and because this concept cannot apply to groups typically deemed races, African Americans, whites, Asians, Native Americans, a mismatch occurs between the concept and its typical referent. Thus, the concept of race must be eliminated due to its logical incoherence. More recently, Appia has acknowledged the importance of human folk races, namely, of the idea that there are forms of social identity that do in fact exist. The way in which they are social identities, however, is a problem because we treat them as if there were some biological factors underpinning them. The folk theory of race, then, is false because it is based on mistaken beliefs. Yet, it is nonetheless true that we continue to categorize people along its lines. According to Appia, there are three ways that we categorize using folk racial labels: by ascription, identification, and treatment. And it takes all three for a given label to be a functioning social identity. As a result, we come to live as these identities and look to them as a central resource for constructing our lives. Furthermore, norms of identification and authenticity arise around them. Let's look at the second philosophical camp, that of racial constructivism. Racial constructivism contends that even if the idea of biological race is false, races have come into existence and continue to exist through human culture and human decisions. So racial constructivism picks up where the racial skeptic, a la Appia, left things. Constructivists accept that skeptics' dismissal of biological race, but argue that the term still meaningfully refers to the widespread grouping of individuals into certain categories, indeed, often by the very members of such racial ascriptions. Race constructivists argue that since society labels people according to racial categories, and since such labeling often leads to race-based differences in resources, opportunities, and well-being, the concept of race must be conserved in order to facilitate race-based social movement or policies, such as affirmative action, that compensate for socially constructed but socially relevant racial differences. Racial constructivists can be subdivided into three further groups. Thin constructivism paints race as a grouping of humans according to ancestry and genetically insignificant or superficial properties that are nevertheless prototypically linked with race, such as skin tone, hair color, and hair texture. In this way, thin constructivists rely on the widespread folk theory of race while rejecting its scientific foundation upon racial naturalism. The second type of social constructivist account of race is the interactive kind constructivism. This goes further in arguing that being ascribed to a certain racial category causes the individual so labeled to have certain common experiences. For instance, if society ascribes you as black, you are likely to experience difficulty hailing cabs in New York, or are more likely to be apprehended without cause by the police. Finally, institutional constructivism emphasizes race as a social institution, whose character is specific to the society in which it is embedded, and thus cannot be applied across cultures or even historical epochs. So, a person ascribed as black in the United States would likely not be considered black in Brazil, since each country has very different social institutions regarding the division of humanity into distinct races. One popular form of constructivism about race, which cuts across these three groups, is Sally Haslinger's eliminativist account. She understands races as racialized groups whose membership requires three criteria. 1. Members are those who are observed or imagined to have certain bodily features that are evidence of certain ancestry from certain geographical locations. 2. Having or being imagined to have those features marks members as occupying either a subordinate or a privileged social position, thereby justifying that position. And 3, the satisfaction of the first two criteria plays a role in member systematic subordination or privilege. Racial identity need not focus exclusively on subordination or privilege, as many forms of racial identity are important, valuable, and in some cases even inevitable responses to racial hierarchy. Haslinger worries, however, that even though we should embrace cultural groups marked by ancestry and appearance in the short term to fight for justice, embracing them for the long term might be politically problematic. Haslinger's view has also been labeled political constructivism because it defines race in terms of political power relations, especially in terms of existence of hierarchical relations of power. Others have pointed out that this leaves out the role that culture plays in social constructions of race. So-called cultural constructivism is supposed to make sense of the potential persistence of the concept of race in a post-racist world. In other words, to make sense of the idea of racial equality. The third family of accounts about race is racial population naturalism. This camp suggests that although racial naturalism falsely attributed cultural, mental, and physical characters to discrete racial groups, it is still possible that genetically significant biological groupings could exist that would merit the term races. Importantly, these biological racial groupings would not be essentialist or discrete. There is no set of genetic or other biological traits that all and only all members of a racial group share that would then provide a natural biological boundary between racial groups. These thinkers confirm the strong scientific consensus that discrete essentialist races do not exist. But they defend a classification of races that is biologically informed and non-essentialist, one that is vague, non-discrete, and related to genetics, genealogy, geography, and phenotype. There are three versions of racial population naturalism: cladistic race, socially isolated race, and genetically clustered race. Cladistic races are ancestor-descendant sequences of breeding populations that share a common origin. They emerged during human evolution as different groups of humans became geographically isolated from each other and may be dying out, if they have not already, due to more recent human reproductive intermingling. Socially isolated race refers to the fact that legal sanction against miscegenation might have created a genetically isolated African American race in the USA. Finally, defenders of genetically clustered race argue that although only 7% of the differences between any two individuals regarding any one specific gene can be attributed to their membership in one of the commonly recognized racial categories, the aggregation of several genes is statistically related to a small number of racial categories associated with major geographic regions and phenotypes. One important question is whether these ways of thinking about race that I just outlined avoid the objections that are standardly taken to support the elimination of the category of race. The short answer is that they can, but only through human intervention. For instance, socially isolated race theory faced no mismatch problem when applied to African Americans, defined as the descendants of African slaves brought to the United States. However, this racial category would not include Black Africans. Moreover, because African American race originated in legal enforced sexual segregation, it is both biologically real and socially constructed. then genetic clustering would seem to provide an objective biological foundation for a broader racial taxonomy. But differences in clustered genes are continuous, not discrete. And the scientists must decide where to draw the line between one genetically clustered race and another. If they program their computers to distinguish 4 genetic clusters, then European, Asian, Amerindian, and African groups will emerge. If only 2 clusters are sought, then only African and Amerindian races remain. Thus, genetic clustering avoids racial mismatch only through the decision of the scientists analyzing the data. The same problem confronts cladistic race accounts. Since the number of races will vary from 9 at the most recent period of evolutionary reproduction isolation to just 1 if we go back to the very beginning, since all humans were originally Africans. But in addition, cladistic race faces a stronger mismatch by cross-classifying groups that we typically think of as part of the same race. For example, by linking Northeast Asians more closely with Europeans than with more phenotypically similar Southeast Asians. To cut a long story short, in each case, racial population naturalism encounters problems in trying to demarcate discrete boundaries between different biological populations. If discreteness is indispensable to a human racial taxonomy, then mismatches can only be avoided, if at all, through human intervention. Jan Hocking provides a careful argument in favor of the provisional use of American racial categories in medicine, noting that racial categories do not reflect essentialist uniform differences. He reiterates the finding that there are statistically significant genetic differences among different racial groups. As a result, an African American is more likely to find a bone marrow match from a pool of African American donors than from a pool of white donors. Thus, Hocking defends the practice of soliciting African American bone marrow donors, even though this may provide fodder to racist groups who defend an essentialist and hierarchical conception of biological race. Conversely, Dorothy Roberts emphasizes the dangers of using racial categories within medicine, suggesting that it not only validates ideas of biological racial hierarchy, but also contributes to conservative justifications for limiting race-based affirmative action and even social welfare funding, which supposedly would be wasted on genetically inferior minority populations. The bigger challenge of race-based medicine is that it might give rise to a new political synthesis of color-blind conservatism with biological racialism, even if many versions of color-blind conservatism do not de facto rely at all on biological justifications. We will take up the question of how the concept of race should or shouldn't be used in medicine in the next lecture. But for now, I would like to add a last piece to the puzzle of contemporary philosophical debates about race. And this piece concerns the relationship between the concepts of race and ethnicity. An influential work is that of Stephen Cornell and Douglas Hartman, who rely on social constructivism to define both race and ethnicity. They see race as a human group defined by itself or others as distinct by virtue of perceived common physical characteristics that are held to be inherent. Determining which characteristic constitute a race is a choice human beings make. Neither markers nor categories are predetermined by any biological factors. Ethnicity, on the other hand, according to them, is defined as a sense of common ancestry based on cultural attachments, past linguistic heritage, religious affiliations, claimed kinship, and some physical traits. Racial identities are typically thought of as comprising multiple ethnic identities. For instance, People who are racially categorized as black may possess a variety of ethnic identities based on either on African national or cultural markers, Kenyan, Zulu, or the newer national, subnational, or transnational identities created through the mixing of an enslaved population in the Americas, African American, Haitian, West Indian. Cornell and Hartman propose 5 additional characteristics that distinguish race from ethnicity. Racial identity is typically externally imposed by outsiders. Race is a result of early globalization, when European explorers discovered and then conquered people with radically different phenotypical traits. Race typically involves power relations, from the basic power to define the race of others to the more expansive power to deprive certain racial groups of social, economic, and political benefits. Racial identities are typically hierarchical, with certain races being perceived as superior to others, and racial identity is perceived as being inherent, innate, something individuals are born with. Race and ethnicity differ strongly in the level of agency that individuals exercise in choosing their identity. Individuals rarely have any choice over their racial identity due to the immediate visual impact of the physical trait associated with race. Individuals are thought to exercise more choice over ethnic identification, since the physical differences between ethnic groups are typically less striking, and since individuals can choose whether or not to express the cultural practices associated with ethnicity. So, for instance, an individual who phenotypically appears white with ancestors from Ireland can more readily choose whether to assert their Irish identity, for instance by celebrating St. Patrick's Day, than whether to choose their white identity. Despite the differences just cited between the concepts of race and ethnicity, the line between them can get blurred, as in the case of Asians and Latinos in the United States. Take the Asian American racial identity, which encompasses a remarkable level of ethnic diversity. This results from a combination of external assignment and agency, as when Asians actively respond to anti-Asian discrimination or violence through political action and a sense of shared fate. Similarly, the African Americans can be seen as the earliest and most developed pan-ethnic groups in the United States. Hispanic or Latino identity exhibits traits similar to these traits called pan-ethnicity. For instance, unlike Asian identity, Hispanic identity is not even a formal racial identity under the U.S. Census. However, in formal perception, formal laws and discrimination based on physical appearance tend to lump together various nationalities and ethnicities that share some connection to Latin America. This blurring of boundaries makes it conceivable that groups today considered to be sociological racial groups could transform into something more like an ethnic group. Not all the taxonomies and debates about race in which philosophers are engaged have direct implications for the problem of race in medicine, but they point to the complexities of using the concept of race, even in a post-racist world, no matter how far away that world still is.